Picture the Great Pyramid of Giza. 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 9 tons, somehow dragged, lifted, and stacked into a shape that's still standing 4,500 years later. And yet, if you go looking for a single wheel anywhere near that construction site, you won't find one. No cart tracks. No wagon wheels. Nothing. For centuries, people have taken that absence as proof that the Egyptians simply never figured out the wheel. It's one of the most repeated facts in pop history. It's also wrong. Egypt knew about the wheel for over 1,000 years, in fact, before it ever touched a road. So what actually happened here? Why did one of history's most advanced civilizations sit on this technology instead of using it? Let's start with the timeline, because it matters more than people think. The Great Pyramid was built around 2560 to 2540 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty. Archaeologists have found no evidence that any wheeled vehicle existed in Egypt at that time. The pyramid builders were working before the wheel arrived in Egypt at all, for transport purposes at least. But the wheel wasn't unknown in Egypt for its entire history. The country used it, just not for hauling stone or people. The potter's wheel was in use in Egypt from an early period, turning clay for pottery long before anyone thought to put a wheel under a cart. That's a completely different application. A spinning disc on a fixed axis versus a rolling wheel bearing a moving load. But it tells us the underlying concept, a rotating circular device, wasn't foreign to Egyptian craftsmen. The first hints of an actual rolling will show up later than most people assume. Reference sources place the earliest depictions of wheels in Egypt in the late Old Kingdom, roughly 2675 to 2130 BCE. And even then, they're not on carts. One tomb painting from the 6th dynasty shows wheels used to help move a siege ladder during a military assault on a town. Wheeled sledges also appear in tomb paintings from the 5th, 11th, and 13th dynasties. All of these early wheels were solid, with no spokes. The real turning point came from outside Egypt. Around 1650 to 1550 BCE, during what's called the Second Intermediate Period, a group known as the Hyksos took control of parts of northern Egypt, and they brought horse-drawn chariots with them. This is when spoked wheels first appear in the archaeological record in Egypt. The earliest known example comes from a small model, a wheeled cart carrying a model boat, found in the tomb of Ahotep, mother of Ahmose I, the pharaoh who founded the 18th dynasty and expelled the Hyksos. So by roughly 1600 BCE, a full 900 years after the Great Pyramid was completed, Egypt finally had a genuinely functional lightweight, spoked wheel. And they used it. Chariots became a major part of Egyptian military culture in the New Kingdom. You've probably seen the imagery. Pharaohs charging into battle in 2-wheeled chariots, firing arrows from a moving platform. That's not myth, that's well documented. And it's exactly why so many people assume Egypt had the wheel the whole time. They're picturing New Kingdom chariots and mentally pasting them onto Old Kingdom pyramid construction, 1,000 years apart. Here's the part that actually answers the video's question. Once Egypt had working wheels, why didn't wheeled carts and wagons take over as the standard way to move goods and people, the way they did in Mesopotamia? Egyptologist Heidi Kopjunk, who has studied Egyptian transport in detail, notes that wheeled vehicles did exist in ancient Egypt, something like half a dozen 2-wheeled carts and nearly 30 types of 4 to 8-wheeled wagons have been identified, some with solid wheels and some with spokes. But they were used almost exclusively for freight, not for carrying people. And they carried loads that were too heavy for a donkey or ox to carry directly, but still lighter than what a sledge could handle. For the very heaviest loads, like an 80-ton stone statue, sledges remained the tool of choice, specifically because they avoided the risk of a wheel or axle snapping under that kind of weight. Egyptian carpentry and metallurgy simply hadn't produced axles strong enough to survive multi-ton loads without failing. There's a famous relief from the tomb of Jehudi-Hotep, a Middle Kingdom official, showing an 80-ton statue being hauled 15 kilometers on a wooden sledge, and includes a small but telling detail: a worker pouring water in front of the sledge's runners. That water lubricated the sand, cutting the friction dramatically. It's a low-tech solution, but for the scale of load involved, it worked, and it didn't carry the failure risk that an overloaded wheel and axle did. There's a second piece to this, and it's arguably the bigger one. Egypt didn't need wheeled roads the way other civilizations did, because it already had the best transport corridor in the ancient world running straight through the middle of the country, the Nile. Egypt's most important, most visible, and best documented means of transportation was its watercraft, according to Egyptologist Steve Vinson of Indiana University. Most major cities sat directly along the river, and the Nile's current flows north while the prevailing wind blows south, which meant boats could sail upstream and drift downstream, covering the entire length of the country without needing to build and maintain a road network at all. Heavy stone for monuments was frequently floated on barges along the Nile, especially during the annual flood season when water levels were high enough to bring cargo close to construction sites. Outside the Nile corridor, the terrain worked against wheels too. Large stretches of the floodplain were soft sand or seasonally waterlogged mud, conditions that are genuinely difficult for a rigid wheel and axle to cross without a prepared, hardened road surface. And Egypt didn't invest heavily in road building the way, say, the later Roman Empire did. A rolling wheel needs a firm surface to be efficient. On loose sand, a wheel can actually perform worse than a sledge, which spreads weight over a wider area and doesn't dig in the same way. So the honest answer isn't the Egyptians never invented the wheel. It's closer to this. Egypt independently developed rotational technology early on, in the form of the potter's wheel, but a rolling transport doesn't show up until the late Old Kingdom, and it doesn't become genuinely practical until spoked wheels arrive with Hyksos-introduced horse chariots around 1600 BCE. Even after that point, wheeled carts stayed a specialized tool for moderate freight loads, while the heaviest work still went to sledges, and everyday long-distance transport ran on the Nile instead of roads. It's less a story about a civilization failing to invent something, and more a story about a civilization solving the same problem. How do you move things across long distances? With a completely different toolkit. Rivers, sledges, water-lubricated sand, and eventually chariots for war and status rather than commerce. The wheel wasn't a missing piece of Egyptian technology. It was a piece they had and mostly chose not to build their transport system around, because for most of their history, they didn't need to. If you want to go deeper on how the Hyksos actually took power in northern Egypt, and what that period looked like before almost drove them out, that's a video in itself, and one worth making next. Let me know in the comments if that's one you'd want to see.